Part 4 of Technical Error by Hal Clement. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Technical Error, Part 4. "Do you suppose they can find out what was wrong with it?" queried Stevenson. "We should." It was Cray's voice on the radio. "The principle of this gadget is exactly like our own. The only trouble is that they've used that blasted molecular attraction fastening method everywhere. It's taken quite a while to get it apart." "It's odd that the technology of these beings should have been so similar to ours in principle, and yet so different in detail," remarked Grant. "I've been thinking it over, and can't come to any conclusion as to what the reason could be. I thought perhaps their sense organs were different from ours, but I have no idea how that could produce such results. Not surprising, since I can't imagine what sort of senses could exist to replace or supplement ours." "Unless there are bodies in the sealed-off corridor and rooms, I doubt if you'll ever find the answer to that one," answered Preble. "I'll be greatly surprised if anyone ever proves that this ship was made in this solar system." "I'll be surprised enough if anyone proves anything at all constructive about it," returned Grant. Cray's voice interrupted again. "There's something funny about part of this," he said. "I think it's a relay, working from your main controls, but that's only a guess. It's not only connected to the electric part of the business, but practically built around the fuel inlet as well. By itself, it's all right. Solenoid and moving core type. We've had it apart, too." "What do you plan to do?" asked Grant. "Have you found anything wrong with the unit as a whole?" "No, we haven't. It has occurred to me that the breach was unsealed for some purpose other than repair. It would make a handy emergency exit, and that might account for the careless way it was resealed. We were thinking of putting it back together, arranging the relay so that we can control it from here and test the whole tube. Is that all right with you?" "If you think you can do it, go ahead," replied Grant. "We haven't got much to lose, I should say. Could you fix up the whole thing to drive by local control?" "Possibly. Wait till we see what happens to this one." Cray moved out of the line of sight in the engine room doorway, and his radio waves were cut off. Stevenson moved to the doorway to watch the process of reassembly. The other three went up to the control room. The eeriness of the place had worn off. There was no longer the suggestion of the presence of the unknowable creature who had once controlled the ship. Preble was slightly surprised, since it was now night on this part of the asteroid. Any ghostly suggestion should have been enhanced rather than lessened. Familiarity must have bred contempt. No indicator lights graced the control panel. Grant had half hoped that the work in the engine room might have been recorded here, but he was not particularly surprised. He had given up any hopes of controlling the vessel from this board, as his remark to Cray had indicated. "I hope Cray can get those tubes going," he said after a lengthy silence. "It would be enough if we could push this ship even in the general direction of Earth. Luckily, the orbit of this body is already pretty eccentric. About all we would have to do is correct the plane of motion." "Even if we can't start enough tubes to control a flight, we could use one as a signal flare," remarked Preble. "Remember, the Mazar is in this sector. You once had hopes of contacting her with the signal equipment of this ship, if you could find any. The blast from one of these tubes striking a rock surface would make as much light as you could want." "That's a thought," mused Grant. "As usual, too simple for me to think of. As a matter of fact, it probably represents our best chance. We'll go down now and tell Cray simply to leave the tube going if he can get it started." The four men glided back down the corridor to the engine room. The reassembly of the breech mechanism was far from completed, and Grant did not like to interrupt. He was, of course, reasonably familiar with such motors, and knew that their assembly was a delicate task even for an expert. Cray's makeshift magnetic device for controlling the relay when the breach was sealed was a comment on the man's ingenuity. It was not his fault that none of the men noticed that the core of the relay was made of the same alloy as the great screwcocks which held the engine-room doors shut, and the small bolts on the doors in the cargo hold. It was, in fact, a delicate governor, controlling the relation between fuel flow and the breech field strength, a very necessary control, since the field had to be strong enough to keep the hot vapor from actual contact with the breech, but not strong enough to overcome the effect of the fields protecting the throat of the tube, which were at right angles to it. There was, of course, a similar governor in man-made motors, but it was normally located in the throat of the tube, and was controlled by the magnetic effect of the ion stream. The device was not obvious, and of course was not of a nature which a human engineer would anticipate. It might have gone on operating normally for an indefinite period if Cray had used any means whatever, except magnetic manipulation, to open and close the relay. The engineers finally straightened and stood back from their work. The breech was once more in place, this time without the error in alignment which had caused the discovery of the seal. Clamped to the center of the dome, just where the fuel feed tube merged with its surface, was the control which had been pieced together from articles found in the tool cabinets. It was little more than a coil whose field was supposed to be strong enough to replace that of the interior solenoid through the metal of the breech. Preble had gone outside and now returned to report that the slight downward tilt of the end of the ship in which they were working would cause the blast from this particular tube to strike the ground 50 or 60 yards to the rear. This was far enough for safety from splash, and probably close enough so that the intensity of the blast would not be greatly diminished. Cray reported that the assembly, as nearly as he could tell, should work. "Then I suggest that you and anyone you need to help you remain here and start it in a few moments, while the rest of us go outside to observe results. We'll keep clear of the stern, so don't worry about us," said Grant. "We're on the night side of the asteroid now, and as I remember, the Mazar was outward and counterclockwise of this asteroid's position 24 hours ago. By heaven, I've just realized that all this has occurred in less than 20 hours. She should be able to sight the flare at 20 million miles, if this tube carries half the pep that one of ours would." Cray nodded. "I can start it alone," he said. "The rest of you go on out. I'll give you a couple of minutes, then turn it on for just a moment. I'll give you time to send someone in if anything is wrong." Grant nodded approval and led the other 5 men along the main corridor and out the airlock. They leaped to a position perhaps 150 yards to one side of the ship and waited. The tube in question was one of the lowest in the bank of those parallel to the ship's longitudinal axis. For several moments after the men had reached their position it remained lifeless. Then a silent, barely visible ghost of flame jetted from its lip. This changed to a track of dazzling incandescence at the point where it first contacted the rock of the asteroid, and the watchers automatically snapped the glare shields into place on their helmets. These were all in place before anyone realized that the tube was still firing, cutting a glowing canyon into the granite and hurling a cloud of boiling silica into space. Grant stared for a moment, leapt for the airlock, and disappeared inside. As he entered the control room from the front, Cray burst in from the opposite end, making fully as good time as the captain. He didn't even pause, but called out as he came, "She wouldn't cut off, and the fuel flow is increasing. I can't stop it. Get out before the breach gives. I didn't have time to close the engine room door." Grant was in midair when the engineer spoke, but he grasped the stanchion that supported the catwalk, swung around it like a comet, and reversed his direction of flight before the other man caught up to him. They burst out of the airlock at practically the same instant. By the time they reached the others, the tube fields had gone far out of balance. The lips of the jet tube were glowing blue-white and vanishing as the street caught them, and the process accelerated as the men watched. The bank of stern tubes glowed brightly, began to drip, and boiled rapidly away. The walls of the engine room radiated a bright red, then yellow, and suddenly slumped inward. That was the last straw for the tortured disintegrator. its own supremely resistant substance yielded to the lack of external cooling, and the device ceased to exist. The wreckage of the alien ship, glowing red now for nearly its entire length, gradually cooled as the source of the energy ceased generating. But it would have taken supernatural intervention to reconstruct anything useful from the rubbish which had been its intricate mechanism. The men, who had seen the same thing happen to their own ship not 20 hours before, did not even try to do so. The abruptness with which the accident had occurred left the men stunned. Not a word was spoken, while the incandescence faded slowly from the hull. There was nothing to say. They were 200 million miles from Earth. The asteroid would be 18 months in reaching its nearest point to the orbit of Mars, and Mars would not be there at the time. A search party might eventually find them, since the asteroid was charted and would be known to have been in their neighborhood at the time of their disappearance. That would do them little good. Rocket jets of the ion type are not easily visible unless matter is in the way, matter either gaseous or solid. Since the planetoid was airless and the Mizar did not actually land, not even the usually alert Preble saw her approach. The first inkling of her presence was the voice of her commander, echoing through the earphones of the 7 castaways. "Hello down there. What's been going on? We saw a flare about 20 hours ago on this body that looked as though an atomic had misbehaved and headed this way. We circled the asteroid for an hour or so and finally did sight your ship, just as she did go up. Will you please tell us what the other flare could have been? Or didn't you see it?" It was the last question that proved too much for the men. They were still laughing hysterically when the Mizar settled beside the wreck and took them aboard. Cray alone was silent and bitter. "In less than a day," he said to his colleague on the rescue ship, "I wrecked 2 ships, and I haven't the faintest idea how I wrecked either one of them. As a technician, I'd be a better ground-car mechanic. That second ship was just lying there waiting to teach me more about shop technique than I'd have learned in the rest of my life. And some little technical slip ruined it all." But whose was the error in technique? End of Part 4. The end of Technical Error by Hal Clement.